Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking about true love leaves no room for domestic violence. Tomorrow, as you know, is Valentine's Day, a time where people talk about true love, my one true love. Today, in our culture, often we base things more on feelings than we actually base on facts. And I'll explain how this relates in a moment. So often something that is a fact becomes made a point of, well, that's really up for debate. Something that is up for debate is often made into a fact. And let me use a fairly extreme example of that. Has anyone heard of the cat man? A couple of people. Well, the cat man is a man who believes that he's really a cat. And so he's had many surgeries to look as much as he possibly can like a cat. And he's got these whiskers that come out of his face as part of the surgeries that he's received. So basically, I'm using a really extreme example because if I actually used one that is a cultural thing that we have, some people actually might get upset. So I'm not going to use one that we might all believe and have bought into that this feeling is fact, but I'm using one that most of us could see, yeah, that's right. No matter how much this person feels like a cat, he will never be a cat. He will never have the DNA of a cat. He will always have human DNA, human tissue. Okay, so that's our society and our culture today. However, we start to look at things and view feelings as actually facts. So a lot of people, what they feel is true love, to them it's a fact that it's true love. And emotions are seen as the end all. I'm really, truly love you because of my emotions, because of my feelings. But we know in many homes the facts are quite different, because love really began, it's a commitment. It's not just a feeling, but it's a commitment. In the traditional wedding vows, we would talk often as a part of those, do you promise to love, cherish, and protect her, him? So there's that promise that's been made as a commitment to love, cherish, and protect. But quite often today, people don't see how important that protect, cherish part is. Domestic violence in any form goes completely against that commitment to protect, to cherish, to support. I'll read a definition that I got off the internet of domestic violence from Reach Out in Australia. Domestic violence, also called intimate partner violence, happens in many forms, including physical, emotional, and economic violence, and can affect people of any age. It does not have to be within the home to be classified as domestic violence. It is a form of violence that can occur within any relationship, family, or intimate partner. Domestic violence is about power and control, and there are many ways this control can be expressed. Emotional violence, often unrecognised, but can be very dangerous and very harmful to the person. And not just physical well-being, but emotional violence affects the mental health of people. It includes things like yelling, insulting or swearing at the person, putting them down, name-calling, pretending not to notice their presence, rejecting them, giving them the silent treatment is also a form. Putting the person down in public, saying comments about them that devalue that person in a public setting. You never get this right, you never do this right, why are you always like that? Even those comments, very put down, but ones that you might hear at a dinner table with friends. being afraid, fear through emotional abuse, causing them to be intimidated or threatened, and isolation, limiting the person's movement. I remember one person saying how when she got married, her husband forced her to separate from her family, moved them some distance away from her family, made sure she didn't have contact with the parents. She wasn't allowed to phone the parents. He needed to be present for any conversation that she did have, but that was very limited. And purposefully, repeatedly saying or doing hurtful things to someone, bullying. Threatening to use violence against you, not actually using violence, but the threat of violence and the intimidation and the fear that's placed in the person. Saying things like, no one else will want you. Or going to the extreme of, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself, I'm going to end my life. Or, if you leave me, I'll take the kids away. I'm going to get custody, I'm going to prove you're not a fit mother. So, I remember hearing one person talking about her experience of domestic violence in a very bad situation, and she knew she was in a domestically violent situation and she feared for her life and the life of her kids, but she actually felt safer there because when she moved away, she would not know. At least when she was with him, she knew what to expect, she knew where he would come. But when she moved away, she was afraid, and she spoke about how one night she woke up when she had moved away and he was sitting in her living room, and the fear that gripped them. And it was like, I will always find you no matter where you go. You can never get away from me. Economic, where they have complete control of the finances. They make sure you never go to work so that you never have independence, never have your own money. You have to almost beg to buy a coffee, to go out with a friend and have a coffee. No, that would be too far reaching, because then I can't control you. I never know what you're going to say to that friend. And then social violence, which can include things like insulting or teasing you in front of other people, as I mentioned, as part of the emotional abuse, keeping you isolated from others, controlling what you do and where you go. No, you can't go to that social club. You can't go and play cards at the friend's house. You can't go to church. Any social activities are threatening because you're no longer in my control in that situation. And spiritual abuse, which involves situations where you're not allowed to have your own opinions about whether it's religion, cultural beliefs, values, or your spirituality is manipulated to keep you feeling powerless. Sometimes in a church that could be expressed as, wives, you must submit to your husband. So the husband comes home, you've got to submit to me, you've got to do what I say. And yes, Christians, church leaders, we know it happens, domestic violence within their homes. It can happen in any home. And what the person who's using that scripture is neglecting is the next verse. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And so what the husband is actually asked to do is basically love his wife as much as Christ loved the church, which Christ loved the church to die for it, to set aside his feelings, his desires, injustice, and to die for the church. That's how much he loved the church, because love is a commitment. And so when the you have to submit to me thing is used, that actually goes against what it's teaching. It's meant to be about mutual submission, mutual love, encouraging each other, supporting each other. Our culture today has many examples where violence is becoming more and more common and more acceptable. And sadly, many people are indoctrinated by this. I was looking on Facebook, and this week, Rush V particularly was brought to my attention. Has anyone heard of him? A couple of people. So he has 20,000 followers on his Facebook page, and the comments that he was making on his particular page was basically, if a woman is raped on private property, if it's not on public grounds, then it should not be legally punishable. So we have extreme examples of people who actually believe violence is okay enough that they're actually speaking in public and advocating for legal things that hurt women, that go against the rights of women. I was talking to a friend some years ago when she mentioned that she didn't really have many memories of her as a young child, and she hadn't thought that that was strange until she started to hear friends talk about when I was 2, this happened. When I was a young child, this happened. And as she was talking about that, I identified I don't have a lot of memories from anything before I was 8 years old. Now, when I started to work in mental health, I learned that's a common sign of trauma, that you don't have early childhood memories, that those things are pushed aside. My parents separated when I was 4 years old and were later divorced. My dad was a farmer and I was the 5th of 6 children. I didn't realise it until I overheard Mum talking to a pastor that she had left my dad because of domestic violence, that he had been not just verbally but also physically abusive. And so for my first 4 years, I actually went through the result of what it's like as a child to live in a home of domestic violence. And that's one of the reasons why I have so few memories of my childhood. Another way that it impacted me was much later in life. I found that when someone was angry, my response was a lot more upset than would be to someone who was well balanced and able to cope with that. So if someone lashed out at me, I didn't have the coping skills that I should have had. And that was a result of the child within me saying, I can't cope with this. This is too hard. This is too much. Because what happens is quite often when we face similar circumstances to abuse as a child, but we're now an adult, it brings that child's emotions to the surface. So it can have long-lasting impacts on the young person. I remember having a conversation with my mother much later and asking my mum some questions. And basically, Mum said to me that when she was at the doctor's office, battered and bruised, and the doctor said, you know, I need to report him, she said to the doctor, you don't need to report him, I'm leaving him. And the way she talked about it, she left him not because of the violence, but because she didn't want to have him in prison with his children, having a father in prison. And so often, even though people know they're in a very abusive situation, it's very hard to leave that abuse, even when they do recognise it as abuse. So for Mum, the reason to leave was she didn't want my dad to go to prison, because then we would have a father in prison. And I guess the stigma of having a dad in prison. So anger is very deceptive. There's often a lie in anger, you made me angry. The truth is, we are each responsible for our own emotions and our own feelings. Yes, something someone says or does may trigger an emotion of anger, but the truth is, we have the choice whether we respond or whether we choose not to respond. An example that one of my clinical supervisors used when I was doing counselling was that he would often talk to a man and say, if you and your wife were having an argument, one where you would normally hit them, but there was a policeman that had just walked in the door, would you still hit her? No, of course I wouldn't hit her. No. Are you stupid? I'm not going to hit someone with a policeman standing there. And he used that to break the lie that I can't control it, because this showed you can control your anger. If a policeman was there, you can control it. You can put that same control in place by choosing. You know it's wrong. You know it's wrong because you don't do it when the policeman is there. You can choose to make that choice regardless of the presence of a police officer or some other authority. Who abuses people? It could be anyone, okay? Often the most respectable people, seen as good, upstanding citizens, and often that's a shock. I was having breakfast with a group of ladies this morning, and One of them told me about a case where a sentence was just increased from 7 years to 14 years because the amount of people this person had abused in a community. And all of the victims, are happy, and these are adult victims speaking out about the abuse, speaking about the horror of what happened to them and how it's impacted their life. At the same time, there are many community members saying, he's a good, upstanding citizen. He could not have done this. We need to get him out. So in spite of the overwhelming evidence of the truth, the abuse, sometimes people are just not willing to believe that that person actually could perpetrate abuse. This week, I was interviewing a person around being a survivor of satanic ritual abuse, which goes under domestic violence because quite often it's not just in the home, but they take you, daughter, son, grandchild, to places and literally abuse you. And she talked about the people who abused her included doctors, nurses, judges, policemen, undertakers from funeral homes. There's people from all walks of society and life. And so that's why it's so important when someone comes and talks about their experience, no matter what your view is of that person, no matter what you think, that you believe them, that you say, I'm hearing what you're telling me. Because one of the dangers is that the person who's being abused, they are silenced at all cost. There are threats to them. If you ever speak out about this will happen to you. And even when it's not said verbally, it's implied in so many ways. That person knows there's so much shame and so much fear that they almost feel like they can't possibly speak out, that they can't have a voice. So, high conflict in the home often has a lot more impacts than we can realise. It can impact the mental health, depression, anxiety, not just of the wife that's being abused, but of the children as well. And I'm talking about wife because in this context we're talking about white ribbon, which is about violence against women. We know it does happen that sometimes men also are abused, but in this context today we're focusing on violence against women. And so one person I was talking to, a bank teller, he said to me that when he was 12 years old, he had attempted suicide 3 different times in 3 different ways at 12 years old. And I said to him, what was it that made your life so difficult? What was it that made your life so hard? And he said to me that his mum and dad fought all the time. So emotional abuse. And he felt like no one loved him and he felt like no one cared. So it doesn't just impact the woman, but it strongly impacts the whole family. So I would like to talk about some keys to building a healthy culture in the home, a healthy relationship, to end on a positive note of some things that you can do. So create a positive environment in your home through speech. Make sure your words are words that build up and encourage the people that you are living with, not words that tear down. Words that will bring encouragement and support. Follow up on your promises. And in a home, quite often it's easy. You don't want to let your child down, and so you say, yeah, I'll do that. I'll take you here, I'll take you there. Don't make any promises that you can't keep, and follow up on your promises unless there's something really drastic, and then you would explain and say, look, I am so sorry. And that doesn't go down well if it's something you do all the time, but if it's a rare occasion, that is heard and understood. I'm so sorry this happened and I'm really sorry. I was so looking forward to coming to that sports game. Listen non-judgmentally. I'll give you an example of how we can easily really misunderstand one another. And this is not domestic violence, but it just shows how easy it is for miscommunication to occur. I was at 15 working in a bookstore, and I was having to sell all kinds of books, and some of those books went against my Christian values. And I just felt like God didn't want me to continue to work in that environment. And so I prayed about that, and I actually had someone approach me, a youth worker at a youth camp, and say, I'm just sensing that God doesn't want you where you are. Now, I'd been praying about that, so it wasn't like they told me to leave the job, but it was just something they put before me as what they were sensing. It was confirmation. I tried to make an appointment to see my pastor to tell him about what had happened and that I was resigning, and he was too busy for a couple of weeks. So by the time I spoke to him, I had resigned. And I was told off. Why didn't you come and talk to me first? You should have come and talked to me before you threw your job in. And I didn't even really get to share my heart of why I'd left that job and what I'd felt. And I was really misunderstood. It's so easy for us as humans to really misunderstand one another. And so listening without judging something will give an opportunity for the person to explain, your husband, your wife, to explain why they spent more than you expected and what that was about. Honesty. We need honesty to have healthy relationships, don't we? We need to feel like we can trust each other. Servant-focused. Thinking about ways you can serve each other builds a really healthy culture in the home. Can I get a cup of coffee for you? Would you like a drink of water? Just the little things sometimes. And if your husband or wife asks you for something, not resenting that and not feeling like I always have to do that, but mutually building that mutual servanthood. Separation of behaviour from the person. So if something is wrong, instead of saying, you're a terrible wife, okay, or you're a terrible husband, separating the behaviour. You know, I didn't appreciate it when you did that. It's the behaviour that you're not appreciating it. So learning to separate behaviour from things. And the last thing I want to say is we live in a society that has learned to value things and use people generally, using people to get things. And so my word of encouragement to you would be to value people and use things. Things aren't important, things are replaceable. People are not replaceable, people are important. Thank you so much for allowing me to come and to share at your White Ribbon event.
Thank you.